what's important is to think about these things obviously while you're alive, because you can't later. And what do you want to happen? Make it a conscious decision. Don't just default into doing something that later, maybe instead of what you intended to be a blessing to your legacy, ends up being a nightmare in terms of infighting and who inherits what.
Today we're discussing estate planning, something that's near and dear to me because, as you know, we get to live vicariously through our clients. And over the 20 or so years, I've redone my trust 3 times.
You're also a hypochondriac. So.
I am a bit of a hypochondriac, but I've learned from so many people their successes and failures. So I always, when I'm looking at the future, I want to know how to navigate and protect my family. Right. So if you wouldn't mind, share with the people, what is a proper estate plan? What is the importance of estate planning and legacy planning?
That's pretty wide encompassing, but I think everybody should have some type of living trust, right? And that's a trust set up that you and your spouse set up while you're alive. It's revocable, so at any time you still have access to the funds. Typically it's added with a marital trust, and that comes into play when one of you pass away. So let's say you or Lauren pass away, assets go into marital trust. And at that time, typically, on a portion of it, it can be irrevocable, which is a good thing. And the reason for that is it can be set, if it's set up right, it could be creditor protected. So if something happens, they go after a spouse, it's creditor protected. But even before that, I think the main reason to do something like this is to avoid probate. You know, if you don't have it properly set up, let's say I pass away and the assets go to my spouse, Gisela, everything's in probate. Do you really want everybody to know your debts, your liabilities, everything going on? It's public information. So I think it makes it a lot easier on your beneficiaries if you have a marital, a living trust and a marital setup.
Okay, so let's use you for example, okay? Because this is going to be fun for me. Okay, you pass away.
Okay.
Next year, okay. Right? And Gisela,
I got a year.
Beautiful Gisela gets married to a better, more articulate individual. Right after that, maybe a month or two later, after you pass, she gets married. But 50% of marriages don't work out, right? So they don't work out. So she gets married, and eventually they get a divorce. Is there any benefit in having an irrevocable trust once you pass away to
Absolutely.
Gisela?
So let's unpack that. So if I pass away, Gisela inherits the assets. I mean, obviously, she's been with her since we're 7 years old. So they're her assets. She can do what she wants. But if she were to remarry, and let's say it's not properly set up in trust, and then she were to pass away, potentially this gentleman, I'll use that word loosely, would be inheriting these assets, right? And then my kids aren't. And typically what people want is they want to set it up per stirpes, which is like per your bloodline. So if I want my assets, if I'm gone, to go to Gisela, if she's gone, to my children, not to some other fella, right? And you can look at that a few different angles, Robert. Let's say Gisela passes away and my kids inherit the assets. 50% of people end up in divorce, as you mentioned. I would like to think, like everybody, that my kids, they'll marry and never get divorced. But let's say one did divorce, and let's say my daughter has 3 or 4 children, divorces, and then that gentleman is gone. If it's not set up in a trust, potentially they're getting part of the estate, and I want it to stay in my lineage. So there's different ways that it's protected for that reason, but you can also give them access to it. It doesn't preclude them from pulling out money from the portfolio.
I want to talk about the access they have to it, but I also want to back up. I know all trusts aren't created equal. They're not the same. So
all types you would set up for what the benefit. Are you trying to reduce your estate? Are you trying to creditor protection? Yeah.
Let's use your example, Natalia, because many of our clients do have kids. And Natalia is wonderful, right? So she gets married, and he's not such a great guy. He ends up leaving. Does every trust protect him from being able to have access to those funds?
Typically, it's going to be an irrevocable trust.
Okay.
right?
Okay.
So typically what's done, you set up an irrevocable trust is set up, but then you have it set up with some type of provision for them to get assets. And what that's called is a HEMS provision.
And what's
So
HIMS?
Health, education, maintenance, support.
Okay.
So, which is pretty broad if you think about it. But if she needed a vehicle, it doesn't mean $300K to get a Lamborghini, depending on how the provisions are set
She's
up.
way more responsible than that.
I agree. It means maybe $30K or $20K, depending on how it's set up. Health, that's the first one. Health, education, maintenance, support, which is broad, but it puts some guardrails on it. So whoever's inheriting those assets just can't blow through it. And then the other thing you want to keep in mind is who's the trustee, right? Oh, yeah. Where who's deciding to make sure that the instructions left in the trust are actually being implemented.
You want it to be Lucas, right? Your son Lucas? That's who you want it to be.
Of course. So typically you don't want a family member, is my opinion. Again, somebody may give you a different answer to that. I don't think you want a family member. Imagine if you put an uncle and you're like, hey, uncle, I need $200K for that car out of the dad's retirement account.
That's perfect.
Well, I would disagree,
Okay.
because especially if it's or even a trust account, any type of account that's in trust, there could be tax ramifications in terms of income, in terms of capital gains. But the issue is the uncle may be trying to do the right thing and say, no, you can't have that chunk of money. It needs to be a lot smaller. Let's be responsible about this. But after a while, every week, if you're calling that uncle, they might cave in because they're getting beaten down. And by the way, that uncle later can get sued if he didn't follow the trust rules. So typically what we recommend is have a corporate trustee, or you could have a co-trustee. You could have a brother-in-law or something in addition to a corporate. Again, we custody at Raymond James, so that's typically who we recommend for our clients. But the corporate trustee is going to make sure everything is followed to the T based on the instructions left.
So you could still name Lucas or Natalia as the co-trustee, probably Natalia, as the co-trustee. And is that just for checks and balances, so that in your situation, if Lucas wants that Ferrari or Lamborghini, Natalia doesn't have to be the bad guy and say no, she can put it off on the corporate trustee.
That's exactly right. It just makes sure that the wishes that the survivors follow the wishes of the people that left the money behind. That's right.
One more follow-up question. So we talked about what happens if you pass away and assets go to Gisela, or if you and Gisela pass away and the assets go to your kids, Lucas and Natalia. What happens if now, let's say Natalia, she has a few kids, as you mentioned, and she passes away? Now it's not a divorce. Does her husband at that time get the assets and whatever's gone?
It depends on how it's set up.
Okay.
There's different ways to set up the trust. It depends how it's set up. Again, typically it's like per stirpe. So if they're married at a time, yeah, they could potentially have access to the funds. It depends on how it's set up and what the wishes were.
But if he gets remarried, then it's not set up right. Could your grandkids potentially be cut out?
Potentially. So that's why, again, as you know, we're not attorneys.
Mm-hmm.
What we're going to do is we work with the trustees if they use Raymond James as a trustee, and we manage the portfolio when they set up either on a revocable or irrevocable trust. We manage the assets. We're not attorneys. It's going to depend on case by case. So I'm trying not to be too biased and say what I would do, but I think it's going to depend on what's important. As you know, sometimes we meet with people and they say, hey, once I'm gone, I don't care what's done with the money. So I just think what's important is to think about these things obviously while you're alive, because you can't later, and what do you want to happen? And not only while you're alive, sometimes our clients, as they get older, sometimes unfortunately they're not thinking the same way they did 10 years ago. So while you're thinking clearly, sit down and with your family and your attorney and your financial advisor and figure out, okay, what do we want to happen with our legacy once we're gone? Do we want to hold the purse strings? Do we not? And there's really no wrong answer as long as you contemplated what the answers are. Once you know what the options are, it's your money. You've worked your tail off to earn it. You have a right to do whatever you want, but don't do it blindly, right? Make it a conscious decision. Don't just default into doing something that later maybe instead of what you intended to be a blessing to your legacy ends up being a nightmare in terms of infighting and who inherits what.
Great. One of my last questions is, we talk to many people who have talked to other advisors or attorneys about whether or not they should have a trust or some sort of estate plan. Is there a right time? Is there a right dollar amount or time in life that makes sense for everyone to get a trust? Or how would you say that?
I think it makes sense pretty much for anybody, especially you have children. You with the living trust, you can avoid probate. I think pretty much anyone, in my opinion, needs some type of trust. That's a short answer I'd give you. I don't want to recommend a particular type because there's so many variables.
Okay, so I know trusts are complex, and there's so many different types out there. And thank you for the insight on your family and how you have a trust. It's definitely great. If you were sitting with a new client and there was one takeaway from everything we've said today, what would that takeaway be?
I think it's to decide what would you want to happen with your legacy if you were to pass away tomorrow, and how can you make the life easier of your spouse, of your children. Again, in terms of probate, in terms of, we've had clients that pass away and it takes them years to consolidate everything. And these are people who are professionals, who have a large net worth, who, if on the exterior, you think, oh my gosh, they have it all together, and they didn't have a proper trust set up. And now we're years down the road. Not only can it be expensive, but it's emotionally taxing at a time a loved one just passed away. And they're at this point making irrational decisions with the estate, and they're making assumptions on what dad or mom would have wanted, and that's a problem. So don't put that burden on your loved ones when you're gone. Figure out what you want, and I would do it with your family, right? Make sure they're on the same page.
Yeah, you did make me think of one more question. I know that even talking about trust can be, and sitting down with your family, I mean, you're dealing with mortality, and it's like getting life insurance. You don't want to think about death. You just want to push it, kick that can down the road. With that said, do you think that is the answer to my next question, or what do you think is the answer to why most people don't do a trust?
I think they just don't think about it. Oftentimes, as you know, we'll sit down with people and we go, do you have a part of our plan when we sit down with a potential new client, go over their investments? Hey, do you have a will? Do you have a trust? No, the most common answer I get if they don't have it is, I've been thinking about doing that for 3 years, right? So I think our job as a financial advisor is to be the quarterback of that, not only to show people where there are gaps in their planning, but hold them accountable. And I think people appreciate that. Not to be annoyed, but follow up when we do our follow-ups. Hey, last time we met, we talked about rolling this account over. We talked about getting together with the trust attorney we recommended, or you said you had a great one. Did you do that? If not, why? And I think people, to a certain extent, like that accountability. I think life gets busy, Yeah. People move on with their life and don't prioritize it. So I think, yeah. Does that answer your question?
It's wonderful. And I know there's a ton to unpack. So thank you for all of that. But before we're done today, we got another mailing question.
Okay, let's do it.
Let's say, and this actually doesn't have anything to do with trust, so you're off the hook on that one. Okay. Is it smart, Glenn, to take a loan against your 401k in a down market to purchase a home?
Man, that's a tough question to answer. In general, I don't like people borrowing from the 401k. Again, that's leverage. I could see scenarios where perhaps it makes sense, but in general, you know me, I'm not a big debt guy. If I'm having to give a general rule and I can't dissect it and know the specific situation of that person, their age, what other assets they have, I'm going to go with no. If it's my child, I'm telling them, don't get a loan on your 401k.
It wouldn't matter if the market's up or down. You're just saying don't do it.
Exactly. The market being up or down doesn't matter. I mean, if you leave the employer, you're restricted to have it pay it off at a certain point, or you can't roll it out. You follow me? You can't.
That's a great point, because if you leave, you may leave on your own accord, but sometimes you could get fired and you still have to pay it off. Exactly.
Yeah. At an inopportune time, and then you might have to pay. Let's say you have to pay it off at a certain time. You might have to pay taxes and potentially a penalty on what you have to distribute to pay that loan back.
Depending on the age. Yeah, that's right.
That's right.
Perfect. Well, thanks again. I
good.
certainly enjoyed it. And yeah, next time.
Thank you.